In 1553, Mary Tudor acceded to the throne of England, determined to restore Catholicism. Her father, Henry VIII, of course, had embraced the Protestant Reformation, and Protestantism had become the main religion in England. Mary Tudor set about the persecution of leading Protestants in this country, including Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and her method was to imprison these people, subject them to torture, and if they refused to recant, they would then be taken out and burnt at the stake. They became known as the Protestant martyrs. She became known as Bloody Mary. Because of this climate of persecution, many leading Protestant theologians fled to the continent, and a number of them gravitated towards Geneva, which had become a centre for Protestant teaching and scholarship and overall culture, led by John Calvin, the French reformer. And English Protestants there decided to use their time making an English translation of the Bible. The Bible in the form that we know it, which is Old Testament and New Testament, appeared in about the 5th century and was the work of St. Jerome. He spent most of his life in the Middle East, where he discovered ancient Hebrew manuscripts, which he translated into what was then modern Latin, and also Greek texts of the Gospels. Again, he translated those into Latin. They became the Old and New Testaments, respectively. And that was the common Latin Bible, the Latin Vulgate Bible, which was used virtually unchanged for the next 1,000 years. Because the Catholic Church gained immense power, they became very wealthy, and also became increasingly corrupt, ordinary people really wanted to be able to access God directly rather than through the offices of the church. But in order to do that, they needed the Word of God, which was the Bible. And the vast majority of people, even those who could read, couldn't read Latin. And the church wanted to keep it that way because it allowed them to maintain a degree of control over the people. In about 1384, a man called John Wycliffe, who was the Master of Balliol College, Oxford, decided that he would take the Latin Bible and translate it into English, which he completed around about 1384. The exact date isn't clear. But this was, of course, a long time before the printing press had been developed, and so his Bible translation could only be produced in manuscript, which was a long and quite an expensive process. So England wasn't suddenly flooded with English Bibles. It was more of a slow drip feed. But eventually the church realised that this was a threat to their authority. And so in 1408 they held a synod in Oxford, where they introduced something called the Constitutions of Oxford, where it was declared an act of heresy to produce a Bible in any language other than Latin, and to even possess such a Bible, or even be caught reading it, you could be accused of heresy and burned at the stake. So there was considerable disincentive for anyone to set about translating the Bible, but Martin Luther had kicked off the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and he recognised the need of the German people to have a Bible in the vernacular, and he set about translating the Bible into German and published his German Bible in 1520, although he'd had to go into hiding for much of the time he was making his translation. A man called William Tyndale in England saw the great need for an English Bible, and he approached the Bishop of London seeking permission to do that work. He was denied and was forced to go into hiding, and he began his English translation. After a while he realised that the church were on his case and that he fled to the continent, but eventually he completed his translation of the New Testament, and he had that published in Belgium in 1525. By now, of course, printing was available, and so these New Testaments were printed in large numbers and to great demand in England, but of course they were still strictly illegal, and they had to be smuggled in by various means, and the church went to great lengths to try and intercept these smuggled consignments, and when they were able to confiscate a number of these books, they were publicly burnt. So Tyndale's Bible was very influential. It was considered one of the best translations, and he set about the Old Testament again whilst he was in hiding in Belgium. But he was betrayed, and the church caught up with him. He was thrown into prison, and he was eventually taken out and burnt at the stake. So that was really the end of English Bible translation in this country until Henry VIII came to the throne and gradually accepted the Protestant Reformation, probably largely for political reasons rather than theological. But by the 1530s, he encouraged the production of an English translation of the Bible. The first one was attempted by a man called Miles Coverdale, and that was published in 1535. But he wasn't really a great academic. He couldn't read Hebrew or Greek, and so his Bible was really another basic translation of the Latin Bible with bits of Tyndale thrown in. A second one came in 1537, was the work of somebody called Thomas Matthews, although that's probably a pseudonym. It's thought that was a pseudonym because it was still a pretty dangerous business, Bible translation. But none of the Bibles that were produced at that time were, for theological reasons, were really considered inadequate. So when this group of English Protestants ended up in Geneva, they decided that they would use their time profitably and make a much better translation of the Bible, revisiting the Hebrew and Greek texts from which the original was made. And they eventually published the result in 1560, and that was the Geneva Bible. This is a slightly later copy. As you can see, it's of quarto size. Most previous Bibles were tended to be large folio editions. This was published in quarto. It was the first Bible to subdivide chapters into verses. We tend to talk of chapter and verse when we're describing the accuracy of a quotation, but that could only come after the Geneva Bible appeared. The early editions were profusely illustrated with woodcuts, which will have had quite a dramatic effect on the reader, because although we're subjected to images of all kinds today, we're surrounded by imagery. In those days, the only images that people would be aware of were paintings on the walls of churches, and so they would have quite a dramatic impact. This is a later edition. This is actually 1608, and doesn't have many of the illustrations at all. One feature of the Geneva Bible, this is the engraved title page, and this is in a Roman font. Much of the bulk of the text is in what is known as black letter, which is a sort of Gothic typeface, which was in general use at that time. Using a Roman typeface was quite a new innovation, so this Bible had quite a modern feel to it. It was very much a Puritan's Bible. People like John Knox are thought to have had quite an influence on it. And an example of the Puritan tone comes in Genesis chapter 3 verse 7. In other editions of the Bible, where Adam and Eve find themselves in the Garden of Eden and realise that they're naked, they use fig leaves to preserve their modesty. In the Geneva Bible it says, "Then the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves breeches." So the authors of this Bible decided that a stout pair of breeches was more in keeping, and that has given its popular name to this Bible, because as well as the Geneva Bible, it's also known as the Breeches Bible. Its puritanical tone was really the cause of its downfall, because when James I came to the throne, he disliked it intensely. He found it overbearing, almost patronising. The Bible has many marginal notes which were there to explain some more difficult passages to the reader. King James I disliked these intensely, but he also in particular he was unhappy about the first chapter of Exodus, which challenged the power of a king compared with the power of God. And so it was these anti-monarchist sentiments which in particular turned him against the Geneva Bible, and he authorised another translation which became universally known as the King James Version. It was the work of a large number of translators, and it was eventually completed and published in 1611. And it was it really meant that it was more widely accepted than the Geneva Bible. The King James Version, of course, is far more elegant in its text and its language, and in fact it's considered to be probably one of the greatest books ever produced in the English language. So the Geneva Bible really declined in its popularity, although it was still popular with people like Oliver Cromwell later on. But it finally went out of print in 1644, so it was relatively short-lived, just over 80 years. But it was the Bible of William Shakespeare. It was the Bible used by John Bunyan when he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. And it was the Bible taken by the Pilgrim Fathers to America when they colonised the east coast of America. So, excuse me, it certainly played an important role, although short-lived,